Charlie Hill. I'm Charlie Hill. I'm currently Curator of Canadian Art at the National Gallery of Canada. In that function, I really don't play a role in terms of queer or gay liberation. It's more my past history. When I was at University of Toronto, I was the first president of the University of Toronto Homophile Association in '69. A position I got into by default more than anything else, as so many things in my life happen. The two people I think who were key to the foundation of the University of Toronto Homophile Association were Jerry Moldenhauer and Ian Young, both of whom were certainly more knowledgeable than I was. But as neither of them were students, and we wanted to have it us as a student organization and also have access to student council funding for specific projects. I was the only student willing to go public at that time, so I became the president with Jerry and Ian on the executive. And so that my involvement with the University of Toronto Homophile Association really lasted through '69-'70 when I was still at U of T, and also in '70-'71, though I had actually at that point left the university and was teaching at the Ontario College of Art, gave a course in Canadian art history. In the second year, the Community Homophile Association of Toronto was established with George Hislop, and it was an outgrowth of the U of T group, because it was always felt in that first year that there was a need for outreach to the larger community, that the issues we were dealing with were in no way specific to U of T, and I think there was a lot of people out there who felt they couldn't involve themselves with the U of T group because they weren't at the university. So George and Pat Murphy were key in establishing CHAT. And then subsequently in the spring of 72, I worked on a local initiative program grant that they had at CHAT for a phone line, an emergency information phone line. And then I came back to Ottawa, although actually I had been coming back to Ottawa most summers anyway, to work. And then when I came back to Ottawa, the Gays of Ottawa had already been formed after the demo of in August '71. There was a group that got together, and I was asked to join them. And when after I'd gone back to Toronto, that fall of '71, the Gays of Ottawa was established. I got involved with Gays of Ottawa the summer of '72, and then became president of Gays of Ottawa in the fall of '72, and was there, I think, till about '75 as president of Gays of Ottawa. So my involvement in gay liberation really is quite old at this point. I went back briefly to work on the phone line at Gays of Ottawa, but that was a disaster. And certainly by that point, my interests and my job had moved me into other directions. And so while I've certainly continued to be interested, but I've not really been active since the mid-'70s.
So how would you define your role in the queer movement? And perhaps how would you define your previous role in the queer movement if you don't see it as a part of your current?
I think my role in the movement was hopefully making things happen, bringing people together, trying to stimulate discussion and support projects that others were carrying out. And I guess in some ways you probably should ask that question of other people, how they see my role, rather than how I see my role. I certainly felt all during this that it was a learning process for me, and that's what really got me involved. Not only, of course, the initial anger at the way gays, lesbians, transgender people were treated, and the whole bigotry and the enforced closetness, which was so costly emotionally and in daily life to all of us, but also I think at that point, as I say, it was really a learning process for me to throw off the baggage that I had adopted from my society and family, whatever. That was the internalization of this garbage, which is so destructive. And that was a process of ungrowing. Um, I remember one time, I think somebody from the States came up at Rochdale, which I hardly ever went in there, but Rochdale, they were staying there briefly, and I went to see this person, and I'm not too sure what the conversation was about, but what I remember him saying to me was, when you came in, I was talking to a homosexual, now I'm talking to a human being. And it's an odd thing, but I think that it really meant much to me in terms of my later understanding is to how one can internalize one's homosexuality as just one of the many facets of one's being, and that one is not one thing or another thing, but one is many things at the same time. And I read another line that I heard, that somebody said many years ago, which is one that still means something to me, is you have to make it important to make people realize that it's not important. And which is contradictory, because it is important, but at the same time it is only one part of one's being. And so that I think that what was my role? I'm not really answered you. I guess I was there trying to do my best, organize meetings, taking endless notes, thank heaven. I still am a veteran note taker because recently there was a contradiction in somebody's memory of the history of the first movement, and I went back to all my notes, which are at the Gay Archives in Toronto, and there my memory was correct, luckily, for a change. But I think the role, I guess I saw my role as in part a facilitator, a spokesperson when nobody else wanted to do it. I don't really know what more to say than that.
That's perfect. Yeah, it is interesting if we would ask other people how they would define you. We've had some people when we ask them, how would you define your role? They're like, I didn't have a role. But you did. You did have a role. So yeah, asking someone else what they think their role is.
Brian, it's okay. You can sit down if you want.
Yeah, come on in.
I'm just making noise because the floor creaks.
That's okay. Our microphone we can, like, any...
This will all be
background
edited.
noise,
It's
we can
not...
get rid of it. Okay. How would you define queer liberation? Or would you define queer liberation?
Well, queer liberation, what I guess I still in my own head call gay liberation. I read the description on the web of it, and it sounded to me just like old gay liberation, I'm afraid. I don't know whether I'm missing something, but the whole issue of affirmation, education, political action, personal support, being there, and also being visible. All of those things, I think, were things that we tried to do in the 70s and late 60s. But I think that obviously the movements have gone in different directions, which I'm not necessarily up with. Other movements, of course, have been more focused, like ACT UP, and the whole issue about AIDS. Those were more focused movements, but part of the same thing. And so that I see it really in terms of a constant reminder of our presence and fighting against bigotry and oppression, and also support. Just two things recently, very recently. One, this student who committed suicide in Ottawa, is an appalling story. And then the other one was this guy who was told not to publish anti-homosexual thing by human rights, and has now gone to appeal court and Supreme Court. And the same day, a colleague at work brought one of his pamphlets that they had distributed to a whole bunch of homes in one of the residential areas of Ottawa. So the guy is very vicious and completely out of control as far as I'm concerned. But then, and his hostility and hatred is directed against gays and lesbians and transgenders. So that the need is still there. Certainly in my own personal life, I've been out since, well, to my parents since the age of 17, publicly since 69, so I was 23 or 24. And I'm just, I just, so that the issue is not involved in my own personal life where everyone knows, and it's just not an issue. But I think one is constantly reminded that gays, lesbian, transgender don't come from their own kind. Unlike other minorities, you don't even have necessarily the support of your own family. And so your alienation starts at home, not for all people. I think some parents are very well aware of the options, the directions their children might go, but most, I think, have a difficult time with it. But that can, obviously, the fear of your own family, of having them know, which is both a fear of hurting them as well as much a fear of being rejected by them. And then, so that youth, gay, lesbian, transgender youth, have a very different situation than most other minorities because they don't come from their own kind, or we don't.
I've never heard it referred to that way, but we don't come from our own kind.
No.
And on the other side, we come from every aspect of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean that's the other. The other issue, of course, also is, of course, that many gays, lesbians, transgender do come from other minorities, and so they have a double oppression. And certainly that was the big issue in the early history of the movement, was the issue of women and lesbian, gay women, and the dual oppression. And so the movement, of course, in the early history was very caught up between whether they were going to ally or join into the gay liberation movement, or whether the real struggle going to be with feminists, women's liberation. And that was certainly much discussed at the beginning, of course, and also that there were a number of gay men who were sexist too, so that there wasn't a welcome home necessarily for lesbians. But I think that some of the women's liberation groups didn't accept the lesbians that well either. And so, which is why some lesbians went independent into their own movement. So, I mean, the options were there for many people. The same thing, of course, with Orientals or blacks or whatever, that whether there was in fact a home in the gay liberation movement, which had its own issues of racism, and which identity was more important, which one, ultimately they're all important. But that's something one has to work through and define priorities for different times of one's life.
So I think you've started to talk about this already a little bit. But what can queer liberationists, so those of us currently active in the movement, what can we learn by looking at our past?
I think I think one always learns from history. Partly, just the thing at work right now is that there's a big turnover in staff. So you find with no memory of history, and you're reinventing the wheel. And it's a pain in the neck, and it's a total waste of time that we can learn from the errors and also the correct decisions made in the past, but also the debates and the issues and discussions, which may or may not be different from today, depending on where you live, depending on your income, depending on whatever. All these things affect our current status. And so that looking at history, for me, is always fascinating. I mean, my profession is historian. I'm an art historian, so I always find it fascinating to understand how things come about, and something that would, no reason to repeat what happened in the past, but one can learn from the past. And so that the issues and the history also has to be something that has to be constantly studied and critiqued to avoid mythology. And because certainly, there's often a desire to mythologize certain movements for whatever reason. I mean, they may be constructive, but nonetheless, if they're not based on fact, they in fact can create problems and just in terms of understanding. And we are a product of history too. Things that have happened today can be the result of things that happened in the past. And I think it's important to understand not only, well, one thing that comes to mind is the fact is that things for some people seem to be much better today. But then I'm also reminded by two incidents recently, the suicide of a young student and also the hate propaganda of a particular person, that how fragile all that can be and how things can change and revert. And it's something that one constantly has to be aware of and fight against.
I think this about that, yeah, study and critique our history so that it doesn't turn into mythology.
Right.
Do you think the gay liberation movement borrowed from other movements? And if so, which movements?
The gay movement was very much a product of its own times and a product of earlier movements. I think the two most important movements for was the civil rights movement for blacks in the United States, and also, which of course in itself was also strongly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns earlier in the century. But at the same time, also by women's liberation. And I think those were the two movements that fueled the gay liberation movement. And one, of course, just simply civil rights, legal rights, common legal rights and civil rights, the eradication of prejudice, and peaceful opposition came from the civil rights movement. And from the women's was certainly the whole understanding of sexuality and gender, which was questioned and rethought and reformulated in many ways by women's lib.
What are the most pivotal moments in our histories, and what can we learn from them?
I don't know if they're real pivotal moments in history. They're things, pivotal moments depends on who knows about them. So I was just thinking of Stonewall. I don't think we were really very conscious of Stonewall in Toronto at that time. Which is, of course, happens about exactly the same time as we set up the U of T group. But I think that it really, things in retrospect, you can define particular moments, but particular moments are always part of an ongoing process and don't necessarily seem to be such catalysts. I was interested to read an interview somebody did with me in the fall of '71, right after the March on Parliament Hill. And there's another interview there later, which unfortunately is what happens with history is that, of course, you codify your own history and you become formulary, and therefore you're really not understanding what it is. And that happens to me a lot. But in reading this from fall '71, when I'm still very active, still trying to learn, and still it's part of a search, I found question was asked about the march. And I sort of thought, I said at the time that I think it was the end of a first period for gay liberation. And that subsequent to that, the movement would go into much more focused issues. I think in some ways it did, but the movement as a whole was very involved with law and legal change at the beginning, and opposition to police oppression. And and I was struck by that because it's not really my memory of the movement that we were so involved with law. But in fact, of course, the whole articulation of the demands on the Hill, as drafted by Toronto Gay Action, was all about law, and that was the focus. Subsequently, I'm not sure the movement was involved with that, focused on law, but more on issues, social issues, group issues, and then of course becoming not splintering, but growing into groups that dealt with issues specifically to deal with issues around lesbianism, transgender, gay, S&M, all these other things became much more focused, and people learned and grew and pursued those issues subsequently. But at the beginning, we were less focused. It was a much broader scope.
I think you're right, though, that it's only retrospectively that we define these moments as pivotal.
Yes.
But yeah, it isn't in the middle of Stonewall that people are saying, wow, this is going to be remembered for 50 years. They're going to be celebrating Pride to commemorate them. Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
Ironically,
We just did Stonewall TO.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about that? I mean, we've got a picture in Ottawa here, which is beautiful, on the wall there for the restaurant.
The march?
Oh, are you talking about Are We Still Today?
Are we still
Oh,
doing
We
that?
Still
No, but I mean, also it's the
Right.
anniversary for the We the Man.
Right.
That happened 4 years ago.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I've been asked several times about that because I think it was by default that I spoke on the Hill. And because the two people who had drafted it, their car rolled coming to Ottawa. They weren't hurt, but they didn't make it. So I think that was because I wasn't with Gays of Ottawa at that point, which hadn't been formed. And I was doing as a summer student here in Ottawa, although I was still involved with the groups in Toronto. But summer was a quiet period for any university group. But anyway, the Toronto Gay Action had already been formed. And but anyway, my memory, the biggest thing is I don't have a very strong memory of the event, beyond the fact that it poured rain. We were all soaked. I remember people line dancing. It was a bit of a hippie event. And but also that I remember after huddling under the porte cochere at the East Block, trying to get people to find a place for people to stay, and a journalist from the Ottawa Journal waiting patiently to speak to me, which is usually shouldn't keep journalists waiting, but I did because I had to figure out where people were going to go, and a whole bunch of people crashed at my parents' place in the end. But so I don't really have strong memories of that event. Enough, certainly a certain number of the memories are resuscitated from the photographs that Jerry Moldenhauer took. But it's the whole issue, again, the March on the Hill was a process, a culmination of a process of discussion and drafting, and also 2 years, almost 2 years, I should say, since the founding of the University of Toronto group. And so it was the culmination of 2 years, and of course a step to the future. So it's it wasn't, in fact, I don't think at the time, so in retrospect, of course, it was important insofar as we were on the Hill, and we were very visible. Well, that was always something we felt was very crucial to the movement, that was that we all be visible and not invisible. But at the same time that we, it was one tactic. It was, theater of the absurd in a way, because it was pouring rain. Who the hell was on the Hill to watch us? Beyond, luckily, CBC and a couple of photographers. But we certainly had no audience on the Hill. So it was a bit of a theater in the void, but certainly visible to the RCMP who were watching us. But I think that 40 years later, it's 40 years later. Lots gone over since then.
Are dissonant voices threatening? And do you consider queer liberation radical?
I don't think dissonant voices are in any way. I think they question and they raise issues about what you're doing. I mean, dissonance just to be difficult is an irritation. I know people like that, and it's totally unproductive. If it's dissonance to criticize and build, then I think it's extremely important to any living movement. If it stops having dissonance, I think then you run the risk of becoming the living dead. And is queer liberation radical? my understanding again of queer liberation is gay liberation. I'm not differentiating in my own head, and I think it's not radical. It was radical at the time. Radical is a relative word. It's a difficult word to use. I think that it was extremely important, but it's one of many movements working to self-affirmation, equality, and self-understanding. Insofar as it questions other values, it's extremely important, and certainly those forces it opposes will see it as radical. I'm not sure that necessarily it is radical, because it also has so many manifestations and so many people, from conservatives to radicals. I think that the movement is not one thing.
Are there contemporary issues that you think threaten queer liberation? We have a list of examples here. So we've listed as examples same-sex marriage, the mainstreaming of LGBTQ culture, pride celebrations, identity politics.
I think the biggest thing that threatens queer liberation really is conservative religion. I think that's the most important force sanctioned by the state, directly or indirectly, that in fact is the greatest threat to queer liberation. And but manifestations, cultural manifestations within the communities, such as same-sex marriage, such as pride demonstrations, they're a mixture of things, and people do them for different reasons. I know a couple who are now deceased, or one is deceased, I'm sure the other must be too, but they lived together, were partners in business, and had no legal arrangement between them. They were, of a different generation, possibly quite conservative. And so when one died, the family jumped in and took everything from the other person, and which is, of course, emotionally devastating, but also financially devastating. So that people can go for marriage to prevent such a thing as that, or for a variety of reasons. I don't know why. Personally, I've not felt any need to get married by the state. My partner disagrees on this. I just think it's totally redundant. I'm in a relationship. Everybody knows I'm in a relationship. We live together. We're now common law legally. And what the heck more do you want except presents? But I think but I think I'm too old to have all my parents' friends give me presents at this point, because both my parents are dead. But in terms of pride certainly has gone, demonstrations I should say, have gone in a direction which doesn't surprise me totally. First, of course, it was street performance. They were actual demonstrations of sorts, though then, of course, they became very commercial in Toronto. It's very interesting because in the beginning, George Hislop was always a very commercial person and involved in. George is a very fascinating person because he came to gay liberation, I was certainly as a very open gay man with his partner, but also that his background was in theater and in unions. So that's what he brought to the movement, which was very useful. But also that he directed CHAP, the Community Home Health Association, very much into the direction of the bar scene, the gay business scene. And that, I think, ultimately was risky and not a direction I would like to have seen the movement go into. Certainly that has continued into the Pride demonstration, which I think are driven, from what little I know of it, because I haven't been to one for a number of years, is driven by gay businesses. And I don't see that really has much to do with the grassroots and the issues around that people deal with in their daily life. And certainly the visibility of a gay village has its assets. I don't see any need for it personally, because it's essentially, again, business driven. And so therefore has to do with money and not necessarily with issues, as I say, that deal with people in their daily lives. I have very mixed feelings about those things. I watch from the outside.
So you talked a little bit about visibility. So do you think it's important to be visibly queer?
It's essential to be visibly queer. If you're invisible, you are denying who you are. One's sexuality and emotional life plays a great role in one's life and identifying who one is and self-validation. And I think that if you cannot be open about it, then in fact you're denying something that is very important in your life and results in all sorts of problems. Certainly, I remember as a youth when, of course, I did deny it. I was afraid my parents would find out. I was afraid my friends would find out. And, you know, at public school and then high school, there was a real issue of a potential risk of physical violence, ostracism, being ostracized, so that I did suppress it. And of course, it all gets you caught up in a series of lies. And my biggest problem about lying is I can't remember my lies. So I get caught up. It's easier to tell the truth. But I think that it's not, I don't think one has to, gets back to the issue of, at the same time, yes, you're open, but it's also only part of who you are. I happen to be male, I happen to be Anglo-Saxon background, I happen to be Anglo-Canadian, I happen to be middle class, I happen to be, 25 other things. So that it's one part of me, but at the same time a very important part of me. And I think that for anyone who has to suppress it, for whatever reason, I think it creates major problems in one's life. And one should always essentially accept all the facets of one's being and deal with that.
Do you think that there is a tension between the pursuit of legal rights and the pursuit of social rights?
Legal rights and social rights go hand in hand, but at the same time they're not really the same thing, because legal rights create either remove punitive legislation or provide protection. And but most of the issues one deals with in life are not legal. Those are just things that impede in our life. If we, I mean, certainly I was having sex before 69 when it was illegal. With men, I should say. But at the same time, the removal of the punishment did not really change much in people's lives. That took the gay liberation movement to do that.
And how do you suggest that we address a clashing of rights? So, for example, those seeking rights based on sexual orientation and those seeking rights based on religion.
That's a real problem currently in this conflict between religious rights and gender rights, sexual rights, whatever. I think that the issue is that they are your rights for yourself, not to be imposed on others in both instances. But I'm all for people having their own religion, whatever it is. I may not believe in it. I may think it's all hocus pocus. But if they believe that that's their business, and if it gives them a groundwork in their own life, all the better. At the same time, my affirmation of my own sexuality also provides guidelines and acceptance in my life. And but I don't, not saying that anyone should be gay or bisexual or whatever. Everyone has to find their own way in life. And but of course, religious rights. Some people, not all, some people feel that they have to impose their values on others, and which gets into the whole issue of religion and the state. And is it ethics in the state or is it religion in the state? Those things are often very confused, and so that I think that the right for you all yourself to practice your religion and guide your life as you believe is a very important thing. The issue becomes more complicated when you impose it on your family, and then you impose it on your state, and those become much more complicated, especially if somebody doesn't agree with them. I didn't check a lot after page 1, I don't think.
No, that's good though. So you've got 5 on this page. Perfect. So we're into the section on intersectionality. So what do you think of identity politics, either advantages or disadvantages?
I think identity politics is extremely important if you're a minority. And one might say that the majority has identity politics, they just don't claim it as such. The affirmation of who one is and and acceptance by oneself and by society is extremely important, and especially when you're oppressed or denied rights because of that identity. So, but it again gets back to the issue that one has many identities, and especially when you're multiple minorities. So that bringing it all together and coming to resolution of one's life and bring together all the aspects of one's being is a very essential, and gets back to the issue of not denying or suppressing one aspect of one's being, but figuring out a way to bring it all together and become an integrated person.
So do you think queer liberation intersects with other social locations? So we've included race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, disability, class, etc.
I think queer liberation is just one part of many issues, and of special importance to queers, but also does intersect with other identity liberation or even all social issues that affect other groups. And so an understanding of oneself can hopefully help me understand other people. And so I would hope similarly other minorities and other people would understand me because of their own path and direction that they go to affirm their own identity. So that all of them have common bases, although the manifestations and the issues people have to deal with all are different, and they're going to have different solutions.
And yeah, when you were talking about history before, you talked about how gay liberation needed to come to terms with women, with lesbians being somehow different than and having different issues and different needs, and so that would be a way that the intersection of gender.
Well, the intersection of gender and race are all different issues, and they have different manifestations. One thing, of course, is that most gay, lesbian, and transgender are invisible minority. And so that it's a very different issue from when you're an invisible minority and you're a visible minority. Interestingly, because there's discussion now, of course, at work, the buzzword is diversity, and mostly largely relating to the audience. But they only talk about it in terms of visible minorities. And of course, at the table are several people who are an invisible minority, although everyone knows we're gay. But so that the issues of that different groups face are different. There are different issues for handicapped people. They're very specific of dealing with access as well as prejudice. There's different issues to do with gender, different issues of whatever minority. I think each one has its own specific issues that other groups don't face. I think the one issue that was not raised on the questionnaire is income, and which it plays a huge role in people's lives, especially if you don't have it. That you're discriminated against in very many ways, which have a very negative effect on, or can have, not always, can have very negative effects on your future, your present, your whole life. So that I think that one of the issues that one constantly has to face is discrimination on an income basis.
I find it interesting that queer communities are considered invisible minorities, and yet nevertheless visibility is one of our most important sort of activist tactics. To be visible is so important.
Well, because we are invisible.
Because we're so invisible.
I mean, it's interesting just thinking of the other side, that those who were or are opposed to gays is, of course, they see a great threat in this invisibility, because they can't identify us and lock us away. Whereas, of course, the visibility is a threat of another kind. Then you're just going out and polluting the universe and corrupting young children all the time.
Yeah, visibility to me is also somehow different in a trans context, because we've got this idea of passing.
Right.
So do you want to be a visibly trans person? Is that different then than being a
Absolutely.
trans
It's
person?
it's a big issue. Absolutely.
Mm.
But I mean, again, individuals have different solutions and different wants, and some people want to put their past life behind them. Some people want to live, bring their past into their present. It's very complex, very difficult.
So we're down to the today and tomorrow section, which for us is sort of like a looking forward. So now we've talked about past. Now that we have looked at our history, what do we do now as queer liberationists moving forward? So can you describe the impact of queer youth cultures on queer liberation, and perhaps the role you think that queer elders play in the movement?
Well, I guess I'm an elder, thinking about queer youth, which I don't have much contact with, quite honestly. I think that the issue is that I'm full of admiration because they keep the issues alive. They're the workers now, not me. And I think that they bring different perspectives, dealing with their own culture, which may not be the same as the culture of older people. I mean, we all live in the same world, but of course there are many cultures there, and many references, and many, as I see all these people walking down the street looking at their BlackBerries, and I can't understand it for a second. But I mean, that's been facetious, but I'll say that is the references, the music's different, the ideals are different, the realities are different. Going to high school today, I'm sure is very different from when I went to high school, but then I haven't been near high school since I left. Don't want to go back. So that queer youth, I think, is really the people of the present. They're live, they're the future. And older people, the role of us is either to be brought out of our coffins, dusted off every 5 years, and marched ahead and then back in my coffin, which suits me fine, or just, again, to be present among, as visible gay people in other worlds, in other society, other ways, and other presence. And again, that all depends on, of course, what the work one does, the context one, the life one leads. It's going to be different for everyone.
And our elders are holders of that history. And so for me, I know as a youth in the community, I look to my elders to teach me, because you hold the history, you were there.
Elders might hold the history if they have good memories. The trouble is your memory needs to be jogged periodically. Just as I was, I mean, I've been through numerous interviews as whenever they dust me off and cart me out, and the answers get more and more formulaic, and the pat and slip off and any detailer And so that reading that 1971 interview when I was still searching and learning in the movement was, of course, very revealing and very positive to me, rather than the later interview where I could hear something I might have said yesterday rather than something I said in 71. And I certainly think that's probably why I got out of the movement, was that I wasn't learning anymore, or the directions it was going with, either social work, law, or politics, none of which interested me. That wasn't my life was. I wanted to go. I was interested in art and art history, so that's the direction I got. Which at that time I did. I've never really brought great interest in gay studies in art, and I'm interested in seeing its manifestation, but I've never seen it as an area that interested me to study. Which is possibly contradictory, but it just hasn't been. I've never really written on it. I've never, half the books I've never read. But certainly for some people, of course, it brings together aspects of their life in a very important way, and it's just not the way my life's gone. I see gay art, yeah, but again, my area of expertise is art of the past. And I really my area of specialization really cuts off in the 50s. And so that the manifestations of gay art in Canadian art are not great from that period. Obviously suppressed or destroyed or never realized, never done, because it was too dangerous. And so that certainly, I know people in the past, artists who were gay or lesbian, but it's not an area that I focused on. That's just part of a larger scene. One thinks of Frances Lauren and Florence Weil. Again, still people are denying that they were lesbian. Douglas Duncan as a collector-curator, Alan Jarvis, our former director, were gay. I think it's got many manifestations, but again, as I say, it's not been an area that I've really focused on. But then I've not suppressed it if it's there. It's hard to find.
So going back to talking about youth and others, do you think that the queer liberation movement or the gay liberation movement is intergenerational?
Gay liberation movement has to be intergenerational because different ages have different needs and also have to support each other. And so that I think that the interaction can only be constructive unless elders try to suppress younger people. But I think that on the whole, it's definitely a movement that I've been involved in as an open gay person since '69, and here we are, 2011. It's something that I still feel is important to me. Even if I'm not active, but I will never deny the fact that I was or evolved or my past, which is still part of my present. I live with myself and all history. But for young people, as I admire them, I think their guts, and it gets back to the whole issue of the essentialness of it for gay youth. Because they are the most isolated, they are the most fragile, economically dependent, emotionally dependent often, and finding themselves and breaking away in many ways, at least in their own heads, even if not entirely, from everything they've known. And finding a new identity and possibly re-entering that world. Of course, one carries many other aspects of one's life with one, but if this becomes such a crux of separation when you find out who you are as a youth, and they're the people who really need the support the most, that they can make their own decisions.
And finally, do you think the queer liberation movement is transnational?
Queer liberation movement is, any movement has to be transnational in the sense that we all can learn from each other. And the activities, directions of movements in various countries, various regions, all should be conscious of the other and learn from them. I mean, obviously the situation in different places is different, just as it is for different people. And certainly there are national issues such as in Saudi Arabia or countries where the mores are much more puritanical. Those are very different issues than we'll face here in North America. Again, I think difference between growing up in the country and growing up in the city are very different things. And I think the isolation of people is less so in the rural areas because of television. But nonetheless, it can be a more difficult situation than if growing up in a city where your parents are more likely to know about or be greater consciousness of homosexuality, transgender issues, but not necessarily. So national, yes, not transnational. I think that that we can all learn from each other.
And so the last question I have is just, given this conversation we've had and the questions that I've asked, is there anything else that you think we should know?
Yeah. So do you have a question?
No, I just think that you can.
I know I don't think so. I think, again, it's a process of learning. It's a process of questioning oneself. Certainly there's a heck of a lot I don't know, and there's a lot I don't want to know, just simply because I can't know everything. You have to, one has to define what's one's search. But I guess I would like to know more about your project and your queer liberation.
Yeah. So we're trying to propose a queer liberation theory. So we're trying to differentiate somehow queer liberation from gay and lesbian liberation, but nevertheless make those links. So tie our current movement to history, but at the same time separate us, queer identity as separate from a gay and lesbian identity, and how we're going to move forward now. So I think this exercise, this documentary, is supposed to serve a number of purposes. We're hoping that it will provide some of that education to youth on history, that it will provide a little bit of context of what Stonewall is, why we celebrate Pride when we celebrate it, who was there, who was on the Hill doing We Still Demand, or We Demand.
my wife